All right, well, hello everyone. And as was announced, I'm Marcel Brousseau. I'm also at the University of Oregon on the traditional homelands of the Kalapuya people. And I'm honored actually to present after Joanna, since the UO Infographics Lab was instrumental in helping me design the class I'm going to tell you about, which was called Stories and Maps, and which I taught in the winter quarter of 2020, just before the world shut down. So I want to just run through a few slides in which I explain sort of the nuts and bolts of the class, and then I want to show you a few projects and come to some conclusions about what we did that quarter. So I had been mulling over this course for a few years, and it was an experiment for me, in trying to sort of read stories into maps and maps into stories, and to try to think about how these two different media and two different sort of forms, cultural forms, relate to each other. And it was also for me an attempt to bring what are typically recognized as geographic texts into literary study. And most importantly, I think it was a gambit to try to nullify the distinction between the story and the map. So I wanted to interrogate with my students what in fact makes stories and maps different, and how to consider how in fact they might actually be entangled methods of placemaking, or even the same thing. Perhaps stories are maps and maps are stories. And we structured the course around 8 frames of study: cartographic and narrative theory, place and place names, emotional, social, colonial, and decolonial geographies, GIS and digital practices, cartographic cinema and cinemapping, GPS, surveillance, migration, biopolitics, and necropolitics, ancestral knowledge and community art practice, and finally maps and poetry. And in order to explore these areas of study, we read and watched a range of media objects. Among them, books. So we read 3 books. One was Margaret Pierce and Owen Dwyer's Exploring Human Geography with Maps, a textbook which allowed us to sort of work through geographic discourse and familiarize students, most of whom were non-geographically disciplined students, to familiarize them with the discourses of geography, particularly human geography. We also read Brian Friel's play from 1981, Translations, for our place and place naming unit. And this was an important way of considering how place and place names are deeply culturally embedded concepts, and that place names, in fact, are unto themselves stories. And this was made clear in Friel's play through the drama about the Ordnance Survey taking place in Ireland in the 1880s, and the way in which the British were anglicizing or wholly replacing Gaelic names for places, and in so doing were removing the deep cultural knowledge from those places. And we also read Luis Alberto Urrea's The Devil's Highway from 2004. And in this case, our goal was to see the way in which migration policy in the Southwest is in fact a matter of geographic control, and the way in which the government utilizes its geographic knowledge to force migrants into precarious positions. And what Urrea does in this book is he gives readers the coordinates of the dead, and in fact allows them to have power, allows the reader to have power over dead migrants in a way that the migrants didn't even have over themselves, right? It allows you to actually trace their story and to find them in the desert where they in fact were lost. And so it really outlines the stakes of cartographic power, and shows how control over geography is in fact control over political history. We also watched a couple of films, and this was a fun opportunity to show the students Thelma and Louise from 1991, a film that surprisingly I don't think any of them had really ever watched. And we watched this movie in conjunction with Tom Conley's essay, A Roadmap for a Road Movie. And the goal here was to think about how it is that geographic space is in fact a coded male space, or space that is in fact written and inscribed for the benefit of male bodies. And what Thelma and Louise do is in fact they confront male space in the sense that the geography doesn't actually make place for them, or in fact places them into scenes of violence which they cannot escape from. And then in order to escape, they have to remap the landscape, and they have to use the language of violence to do so. And finally, they, at the end of the movie, as you probably all remember, fly off the Grand Canyon and never in fact land, and actually create space in sort of a non-place, above the ground, but also reinscribe the Grand Canyon in doing so. We also watched Les Roberts' The Bulger Case, a spatial story, a series of YouTube videos made in 2010 in which Roberts traces the roots of James Bulger, a 2-year-old boy who was abducted and killed in the UK in the 1990s. And what Roberts does is he tries to show the way in which stories of tragedy are never really sort of, as they're depicted in the news, put into place. That what is lost is a sort of deep sense of placemaking and the way in which place, in fact, contributed to this tragedy, in that the boy not being found until it was too late was very much a byproduct of wayfinding and local knowledge. And what's interesting about this video is that as Roberts gets to the end of it, he himself enters into a confrontation with a local resident. And so the fear of the child that he's trying to understand becomes his own fear for his own livelihood. So it's a rather fascinating film, or series of films. Of course, we also looked at some paper maps, and in this case, we were focused pretty much exclusively on the work of Margaret Pierce and her, 4 major projects. I didn't put her Penobscot map up here, but we spent 2 weeks working through these monumental maps in which students engaged with the paper objects, and Margaret was kind enough to sell me, for the cost of shipping, I think 10 or 15 large intricacy of these turns and windings copies in a giant box that arrived like a gift from heaven on my doorstep. And we spread them all out in class, and students really sort of dove in and engaged with the intimacy of the paper map that Margaret is trying to impart upon the map reader. And we also engaged with digital projects. So in this case, I was grateful to have attended NACIS last year, where I learned about the 2 top projects, Jen Mapes and Sarah Koopman's Mapping May 4th, and Tammy Hepps and Lauren Winkler's Homestead Hebrew Maps. And in these cases, students were able to dig into different digital interfaces and see the powers afforded through digital media, in the sense that, say, Mapping May 4th encodes oral narratives into the map and allows students to hear stories as situated in the places that they occurred. Or Hepps and Winkler's Homestead Hebrew Maps allow students to excavate through layering, through digital layering, this neighborhood of Homestead in Pittsburgh and the way in which it is transformed by commerce over the years. We also looked at Jeff Ferzoko's Outgoing, exploring New York City's historic queer nightlife, and students were able to sort of use the timeline function and see how digital maps allow for a sense of deep time. And also May Po Kwan's From Oral Histories to Visual Narratives, representing the post-September 11th experience of the Muslim women in the USA, to see the way in which Kwan does this rather incredible mapping of experience as based upon the ability of Muslim women to move about space after 9/11, and how trapped her subject became in her house, as represented by that single yellow lifeline. We had a few guests that visited. Margaret Pierce joined us via Zoom, and she discussed her career as an academic and a cartographer with the students. And she in particular talked to them about her trajectory from creative writing to cartography. And this was actually very valuable for the students, because most of them were creative writers who actually were discovering the map as a way to think, in a new creative way. And we also had the Zuni farmer, museologist, artist, and nonprofit executive Jim Eno join us from Zuni. And Jim was there in conjunction with us, reading about the Zuni Map Art Project, a community initiative that's ongoing in Zuni Pueblo to sort of rethink how Zuni lands can be expressed and mapped by the Zuni community themselves. And so, in addition to these texts and visitors, we went through various processes of analysis. And one of the most important was, of course, thinking about narrative analysis and what it is. And for this, we used H. Porter Abbott's The Cambridge Introduction to Narrative to sort of conceptualize how narrative is, in fact, a multi-layered process of understanding. Narrative is on one, in a basic level, the representation of events, but it breaks down into 2 parts, which is story and narrative discourse. And story is an event or a sequence of events, and narrative discourse as how those events are represented. And to dig into this, we use the great poem by Miroslav Holub, Brief Thoughts on Maps, in which a bunch of soldiers, as recounted in the story, go out into the Alps, get lost, find a map, and get found. And then afterwards, after they return from being found, they realize it's not a map of the Alps, but a map of the Pyrenees. And so there's a sense there where the power of the map is in fact made laughable and yet also reinscribed, because it did in fact work, even though it was a map of the wrong place. And so we thought about how it is that both the map and the story here are sort of enmeshed in this human drama. We also engaged in placemaking. And in this context, we used Keith Basso's Wisdom Sits in Places to think about how placemaking occurs and how it functions through a set of various questions, particularly related to sort of where you are in space and thinking about who was involved, what was it like, why should it matter, what happened here. And as he says, placemaking consists in a fleshing out of the historical material that culminates in a place world. And in order to do this, we actually walked through the campus. We left our classroom and walked down to the Pioneer statue, and we thought about how it is that this statue came into existence and what was happening then. And then we crossed down to the Pioneer Mother statue, and in so doing, we noticed that they were on a single linear trajectory across the campus from each other, in fact, facing each other, and that there was in fact a historical reasoning behind this. And of course, those statues have now recently been torn down by local activists. So we were able to sort of see them before another historical event took place. We did a number of scaffolded assignments, essays. We did a place name analysis essay. We did a digital versus analog reading essay. And then most importantly, we did a story map project. And I want to briefly show you some quick examples of two students' story maps. And so I'm going to share a different screen here, or maybe I can just open this. Let's see. Share a different screen. So hopefully everyone can see Josh Ripley's Leaving Holy Places, which is a fascinating story map he made about the experience of growing up Mormon and starting to understand that the church didn't actually allow him to be who he was. And he used the Mormon literature to, in fact, guide his map, ironically. And he was able to come to a geographic understanding of how the Mormon landscape in Portland was a landscape of sort of anxiety for him. And he was able to move from that to a consideration of how it is that there were other places in Portland that allowed him to feel like who he was. And in so doing, he came to sort of rethink the landscape of Portland and remap how it is he could relate to place and feel like himself in place. And I'll go back to my presentation here.
Your time is just about up.
Okay. Thanks. And we had another wonderful presentation, which I'd love to show you, but I can send people the link if they'd like, of anxiety mapping in the movie It Follows by another student, which was really a fascinating project. So just briefly, some quick conclusions. What students said at the end of this class was rather fascinating. And in some ways, it showed that the class functioned, if nothing else, as a pretty good class about critical map reading. But students said, for instance, I now see maps differently, and that I understand they can come in many different forms and not just these unbiased forms of information. One student said, I noticed myself starting to realize that there's more to places, how many depths and years there are to a specific spot. Students said, I came into this class thinking maps are just tools for navigation, but now I learned that maps can be a great medium for conveying emotion and experience. One student really saw this as a way of rethinking, what's coming next in their life. They said, I'll be thinking about wayfinding. Where do I want to go? What are my landmarks? Who has gone there before? So the idea of their life story as being, in fact, a cartographic or a map-making process.
Time is up.
Okay. And so ultimately we had, a lot of rewarding responses to this 10-week experimental class. And so in the end, I want to thank Of course, Joanna Merson in the UO Infographics Lab for really making this possible. Also, Heidi Kaufman, the UO Digital Humanities minor, for helping me with course development funding. Thank you, NACES, for giving me inspiration last year. Margaret Pierce and Jamina were instrumental in sharing their experience. And of course, the students took everything very seriously, and I'm grateful. So if you have any questions, please email me at mbrousse@uoregon.edu. I'm happy to talk more about this course.
All right, thank you so much, Marcel. That was an amazing presentation. I have so many thoughts, but unfortunately, we have no time for questions, so we're going to move on to our next presenter.